Yes.
Your Holiness, thank you and good morning. Today we will turn our attention to matters of the mind and the brain. And before we get started, I just wanted to, for Your Holiness's sake and for those around, to just very, very briefly remind us that the brain is probably the most complex piece of matter in the universe. It has about 100 billion neurons. It has about 1.5 trillion connections among those neurons. Now, interestingly, more than 40% of the human brain is in the frontal lobe. And we'll be hearing more about the frontal lobe as we go through today and tomorrow. During early pregnancy, in humans, there are about 250,000 new neurons that are grown every minute, 250,000 per minute during early pregnancy. On the other hand, in adults like us, about 85,000 cortical neurons in the cortex die every day, about 85,000. So it's a very dynamically changing process, constantly changing. The brain, although it's a relatively small organ, uses 20% of the total body's oxygen supply. So it demands more oxygen than any other organ. And today we're going to begin to address some key challenges that Your Holiness posed regarding the mind and the brain. Is consciousness a primary phenomenon that transcends biology? We will address the issue of downward causation that we...
downward.
Is there a place in the brain where the self might be located? We will also... What is the relation between first and third person accounts of mental and brain activity? And we'll also address the possibility of free will from the perspective of modern neuroscience, which we'll continue to discuss for the next several days. And certainly that has very important ethical implications. This morning, Wolf Singer, who you first met, I think, in Washington at the Washington meeting, is one of the most eminent neuroscientists in the world today. And we are so incredibly fortunate to have Wolf as part of our Mind and Life family. And he will begin this morning by introducing some of these key issues in the context of modern neuroscience. So I turn it over to Wolf.
Good morning, His Holiness. I'm very, very honored to sit here and have the privilege to try to explain some of the mechanisms that we think we understand in the brain. And let me start with something that we discussed last night at dinner. After we have heard from the quantum physicists that there is randomness, unreliability, non-causality, it occurred to me as a biologist that all these properties had to be overcome by nature in order to make it possible to develop life on this planet. Because if things were random, unreliable, and non-causal, no life would be possible, because there would be no solid structures, and it would be impossible for life to maintain itself in homeostasis. So maybe it's an enormous progress to have overcome the laws that govern the very small in order to make life possible. While we probably needed all these mechanisms in order to transform energy into structure. But this is just a speculation. Now,
시제가 나오는 전정은 셰디 걸어.
에다가나 시타면 간 저거 갈이야. 시타면 걸 저거 갈이야. 지 네바 매바다. 준대 남샤 매버서인데 내주 통고도 왔어. 되는데 디 아니 냐냐이나 아니 소소하다. 남샤 킹고 남샤 망부지 되게 많아 왔어.
So I would like to talk a little bit about the implications that modern brain research has on classical philosophical questions. Because brain research, coming from the bottom, starts to explore more and more phenomena that have been traditionally been dealt with by philosophers, people of humanities sciences. And so neurobiology has something to say on epistemology, how objective our perception is, because we work with the organ that perceives. The mind-body problem, the big question of how mental qualities can arise from interactions among material objects, in our case, neurons. The constitution of the self, Ritchie has already addressed the question, is there a place in the brain where the self has its home, decides, plans, acts, takes responsibility, or is there no such place? Is the self outside somewhere? Is the self continuing after the neurons are all dead? All these questions are questions that the neuroscientists now discuss. And finally, there is this discussion on free will, which is becoming very important for the moral philosophy of ethics, because if everything that we can do is prepared by these neurons, how responsible can we be? What is our definition of guilt? How does this relate to punishment? So things become very interesting now, and I think we watch a time.
제베 갱겐 콜이야 바니시야다 내가 들으셔 강디 대가 내던디게 정말 따로 개봐서 그냥 제가 처음만도 천일부터 할랑가 시간 두고 말아서 다 단대 잘이야 레그만 리버도네 내주사고 방법이 신사 아니게 단 따로 리버도 제가 제 신나야 천일부터 드셔야 과거 위협이지 동도서 I just wanted to underline the point that you are making, that in the traditionally these areas have been pretty much reserved for the philosophers, but now as a result of new findings, discoveries in brain science, you're able to address some of these.
So what happens here in this very moment that scientists talk to philosophers is also starting to happen in the West now. And so we have the same problems everywhere. Before I go explaining some of the data to you, I would like to, I don't have to remind you about this, but I think it's important to make this point at the beginning of a talk on brain, that we can, of course, only imagine, understand, think, reason what the brain allows us to think, because it is the organ that does all this. And we know that the brain is the product of evolution. I think everybody agrees now. And we know the criteria that have been applied or that are applicable to explain evolution. This is, the organism has to survive and to reproduce. And in order to do this, the organism has to get signals from the world that are relevant for survival. Nothing else is important. Not important for the organism to understand the absolute truth. It's important for the organism to recognize a lion and to run away quickly. So the criteria according to which the cognition has been, or the cognitive system has evolved, are not the criteria that one wants to apply in order to generate a cognitive system that is able to understand the last truth. All that was required is a system.
Last truth is what?
Or the absolute.
The main point is that evolution 그 돈에 충분히 인자스 그 사회에 소야랑 담아도 신고변에서 도와야 된다는 레벨만 들어서는 말이에요.
You would agree?
I agree.
So this has of course consequences, because our brain and our cognition could only adapt to the world that is the world of us living beings. It's the world of classical physics, it's the world of solid objects, it's the world in the millimeter to meter range, because this is what is important for us. It's not the world of the quanta, it's not the world of the universe. We don't have to know about the universe in order to survive on this planet. And the consequences that our cognition must be limited. It must have boundaries. It's not possible otherwise, because the criteria according to which it developed are very, very selective and constrained. This means, and I think the days we had behind us when we were all puzzled by the quantum physicists who told us things that we cannot imagine, here we really felt how our cognition is limited, that we cannot feel and understand properly that these things happen. Why? Because we have not been built for it. And this may apply also for other questions. And so I think humbleness is something we need to keep in mind when talking about what I'm saying in the future, because it may be only a very limited explanation of something much bigger. So, what do neuroscientists believe?
나래. 근데 지단 레벨 쿠란 중간 겐진 주가라. 그 버지기 제도 주버인 잔스. 그 타르도 네버 상마 또토에 네버 요마였을 때 자스 부레스. 된산지 뭐병하지 마제 내가 좀 그러셨어. 그런 그 휴에 등지에 직전에 그 초지네. 내가 내주 준주지는 대비 동주 인식 그래서.
So we have very strong beliefs, and one is that all the knowledge that the human being can have, and all the programs according to which this knowledge is used, the programs that make our reasoning, so the way in which we apply this knowledge, that all this is contained in what we call the functional architecture of the brain. So the way in which neurons are connected to each other. There's nothing else in the brain but neurons and the way in which they are connected. And out of this emerges an extremely complex dynamics, spatio-temporal patterns of activity. And the architecture that makes these activities possible is the storehouse of all our knowledge and of all the programs according to which this knowledge is used. It's very much different from a computer where you have a memory and a processing unit and some periphery. Here is all together in the functional architecture. So this reduces questions like, where does all this knowledge come from? Where does the brain have its knowledge from? Becomes reduced to the question, what are the factors that made this functional architecture? And there is again evolution, then development, because human brain develops until age of 20. So some of the younger monks still have developing brains, which is good. They can learn much. And during this development after birth, the functional architecture of the neurons, the way in which they connect, is modified by experience. So the brain adapts itself to reality in which it is born. But much is already inherited from evolution. So we know what our ancestors, the snails and lower animals, have learned about the world. And I will give you an example that the way in which we learn about causality has already been understood by snails and put into molecular machinery that's still working in our brain. So we sit on their shoulders in our understanding of the world. And then there's, of course, learning that you and me still can do to some extent, because the connections between neurons, they remain a little bit flexible, even in the adult, fortunately.
Not very hopeless, right? Total hopeless, remember that.
So he's only saying, so that means we are not totally hopeless case.
Now, this has again important implications because this knowledge, which is already in the brain, is used in order to reconstruct the image of the world that we have. Because if you think that in the back of your eye, on the retina, all you have is a two-dimensional homogeneous distribution of different brightness values, nothing else. There are no objects or so. You use your knowledge in order to put all this in order and segment this from the background and identify it as an object. And so if we had not had all this a priori knowledge in our brain that we know from evolution and from early development and from learning, we would not be able to perceive anything. We use this knowledge in order to categorize the world, identify objects, make sense out of it. And we do this, obviously, in a very specific way. It could have been done otherwise, but the world is as it is. We evolved in this world, and so we do it that way. But maybe there's another way. We don't know. So, an important point is that evolution is very conservative. Mechanisms that have been developed sometime during early existence of life, like in this funny snail, they are preserved until they are the same in the neurons of our brains. So the molecules of the neurons of this snail are the same as the molecules in the neurons of our brain. The mechanisms by which the snail learns that, for example, simultaneity means there's a relation, or B follows A, that A is probably the cause of B if it always comes at the same time. All this is already realized in molecular machinery, which the snail has in its brain, and we have exactly the same. And this is the reason why we interpret simultaneity as something that establishes a relation, or a sequence A preceding B, then A being the cause of B and not B the cause of A, because the molecular machinery is of that kind. Another fascinating thing is, and I think this is important both for all religious systems and philosophical systems that talk about two entities, matter and mind, is the evolution of the brain itself. With the invention of the cerebral cortex, which is the structure, that, what's going on? Which is this part here of the brain. It first came on the earth at the level of birds, reptiles. They have a primitive cortex, but they already have it. And then on this long way over cats and monkeys until finally to man, no new structure has been invented. It's only more of the same. We have more of this. We have only more of cerebral cortex, but nothing new, no new structure. And this raises a big problem, because it is impossible to say that there is a categorical jump somewhere where, for example, the mind could have entered this system. It's a continuous process, and new functions emerge from increasing complexity. But it's just repeating the same principle of organization, making a system more and more complex by adding always similar elements. And this makes the difference between monkey, which jumps out there, has no culture, and us who sit here and have culture. But there's a gradual change, and we can discuss what the main difference is. And it has to do with the ability to...
The consciousness is correct.
Right. So in what sense you're using the term culture here?
Culture I use in terms of being able to invent systems like philosophical systems, religious systems, art, science, everything that distinguishes us from monkeys, which is a lot. So,
so
when it comes to jumping, that part of the culture, monkey is better.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Also, birds can fly much better than we. So, but you make an interesting point here, because what this structure does, it's animals have specialized on many things. This structure seems to be the only structure that you can make more and more complicated without becoming more specialized. And so it makes us more general purpose. This is why the brain is, I think, the only organ that when it becomes more complex does not specialize its functions, but it expands the range of functions. And therefore it has been an evolutionary bestseller. So I would like to give you one example which illustrates how strong the inherited knowledge is in determining how we perceive, and that it is very difficult to overcome these constraints that are set. And this is a visual example, but there are, of course, many others, and the philosophers might sometimes consider that even the way in which they reason may be constrained. Because sometimes...
constraints
If you have a look at these two pictures, if you look to the left one, you see a concave ditches. See, this goes inwards. And on the other side, these are protrusions. It comes out. Huh? Everybody will see it that way.
Yeah.
Now, I tell you, this is the left one is just upside down. It's just turned around. It's the same object.
I see.
It's just turned around. And the reason is that your brain, because of evolutionary structuring, thinks light comes from above, which is natural because the sun is usually up. So when light comes from above and something has the shadow in the upper part, it is concave, it is hollow. And if the shadow is below, it must protrude. And now you know why you perceive this differently, but you still continue to see it differently. So it doesn't help you to know that the brain computes something very complicated here in order to make this appear like this or appear like that. You still see it as you see it. And this happens with nearly everything we perceive. And the problem is that this will happen all the time. We perceive, we reason, we conclude. We are guided by the architecture of our brains. And we don't know to which extent this is the case. We only know it is the case. And this makes it, again, very difficult to know where, since we cannot discuss about this, it is our primary perception. We don't know to which extent we can transcend beyond these fixed schemata according to which we think and perceive and conclude, which is the same argument as in the beginning. We know we are constrained, but we don't know where the boundaries are. So I would like to briefly come. I would come back to the question: how come that consciousness came onto this planet, given the evolution of the brains in this gradual way? And we can say a little bit about it. If you take a simple brain, like brain of rat up here, and you follow the flow of information through these brains, you see that there's a fairly short path from the sensory systems, the receptors, eye, ear, nose, tongue, to regions in the cerebral cortex that process this information, and then to executive structures like the motor system, and then out again for reactions. Now, when the brains become more and more complex during evolution, more and more of these areas of the cerebral cortex are added, and I have painted them here as these blue ovals. And one can now look at the way in which they are connected to the other structures that have already existed. And there's a fascinating observation that these new areas that have come during evolution more and more, and in humans it's mainly areas up front here, and areas in this region. These late coming areas are no longer connected to the periphery. They are connected to the areas that have already been evolved. So which mean
what do you mean by periphery? They are not connected.
The sensory periphery, the surface, the outer surface, sense organs, eye, nose, ear.
That the densak lebe tajorba za kuning but tele de mato wangbo the tegan de mebuch.
And now comes an interesting point. These new
뒤안데 야제 드시면 되죠, 봐라.
야제 좀
야제 좀
왕자 게 되버 소리 지르샤. 왕자 등가서 게 잡세. 또 야제 로서 사바 차제 사바 되기디. 아니 왕불이야 태간 되버 요더니 짤이야 레슨 되버 제시 아마도.
이 류간 패지 두가 말던데. 제가 내는 시간에 쇼. Yes.
These new areas, they are organized in exactly the same way as the older ones. The internal structure, and therefore the function, is exactly the same. But the only difference is that they now get the information not from the eye or from the ear, but they get information that has already been processed by its own area. And this process is repeated. So the result of the first area is processed again by the second area, is processed again by the third, is processed again, can be sent back all the way down and be circled again. And I have indicated with these arrows that all these areas talk to each other. And so the suspicion we have, the hypothesis is that consciousness has become possible because of this repetition of cognitive processes. You have a primary representation of an object, which is happening somewhere in these early areas.
We'll use the cursor.
Yeah. Here it is. It makes jump the picture when I move it. Anyway, So there is an early representation. It's strange, but it's electrostatic, I think, which makes it jump. And then this representation that is already the result of a computation is again taken as the object.
Can we dim the light of the projector?
Or the light here?
Dim the overhead lights?
Yeah, overhead light. Yeah. Do this. Because we can't see the cursor well. The arches.
Huh? Ah, the mouse, that's better, yeah.
Change the cursor to black. That's good.
It's a portable mouse, maybe this
It's gotta be recognized.
This is very clear.
Yeah, you have a good picture here, but yeah.
The others.
There it is.
Okay,
You can right click and change the mouse to black.
right click.
And it's already okay.
Pointer options. Pointer options.
Left click.
Pen color. No, don't do that. Never mind.
It's okay. It's okay. It's okay.
End show, no.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So, this repetition of cognitive processes to take the result of the first lower level cognitive process, subject it to the same process, subject it again to the same process, maybe bring it back to the beginning and then circle several times, in principle opens the possibility to have a representation of a representation of a representation, so to create meta representations. And this could be the trick that evolution used so that higher brains can have a protocol of their own functions, that they can watch their own processes because they subject them to a normal cognitive process.
Then the level ya chashe saba ma bushige ba. Chashe saba digi kidu ko
I
ya.
should not make it now.
Ngema ningbo yoba digi jaje ba ma to ngar mebe ke chashe lega saba shabe ta jaje shabe ke chashe saba jorba digi lega karchi gor서는 코너 남구 그 자와치단디 ngema ningbe 왕자 ningbo joba 디단 지부지 양 임버지라 따고 자와 대바지야 시간만 시부 체제 왕자 닝버기 율체베 걸이야 고 율이야 자와 체행도 걸라
또 누구처럼 쉬면서
그때 말에
시즈직체
라르다 그 율체베 왕기 쉐버 비게베나 또 쉐버들 락 말데 코나조디 인포메이션 디 프로세스 체제 다 넘버 더브제 디야 디 강라 요데베 디기치 다 제버체 야코 율케제 디가 뭐되게 제버체 그
율케네
나다 유스네
Number
re
Tambo number chi search. They gonna like a jene. Number shembe kene. They gonna young number chi check kiek yore. Dila number tambo delia representation. Even the super delia meta representation.
then number series number cheche do cheche ani
Number shembe le join number.
no
Paul, you had a question or comment?
Yes, it's been so beautiful so far, so lucid. I'm sure it will continue. So I wanted to add 3 elaborations, if I could, very quickly. Your first, at the very beginning, you talked about cognitive constraints, and I would like to have it be cognitive affective constraints.
Right.
And I'm sure you would agree with that there are lessons from our ancestral environment that are stored about how to solve problems fundamental to our survival in each of these emotions. And they can, when aroused, constrain the cognitive constraint.
Right.
So it's another level of constraint that isn't always operative.
And they would even determine to which extent knowledge stored can reach the level of consciousness.
Absolutely.
This is the gateway.
Yes.
So we don't have access to everything we know, except if our emotions and our attention system select appropriately from moment to moment to moment, which further constrains our ability.
Complete agreement. The second was you said that we don't know the boundaries of constraint, and would you at some point tell us whether there has been specific experiments trying to penetrate those boundaries of constraint? I don't know that there have been, but if there are, would you mention them?
I don't know of any. I think it would be very difficult to design them because yeah.
The boundary the the chetunine getuya yomayo tolia and jebache experiment cheoris.
Just our last point. Your description of the emergence of consciousness is very exciting, and this idea of being able to watch. And I wondered whether there's a basis in brain science to say whether that capacity is more possible to watch or reflect afterwards than to watch at the moment of experience.
The problem.
The Tamantigia, number you to check. To storage of the Tedanyambolia, and Susulia, Jishing Sorge, Charache, watch Chetuerci, get a shears. That the Chetuguna, and Chavalumus, Jushimbe, Negalia Chetugure, the Chavatan, Chambesor Pache, Cherishas.
There was the question of timing. When do things come into consciousness? And this is a very, very crucial question because it has a little bit to do with this misunderstanding that the downward causation is possible. Neurobiologists would say you always first have neuronal processes, and some of them reach the level of consciousness. And I will give you some data later that show what the minimal requirement is for contents to become consciously perceivable. But then it gets immediately, once it is in consciousness, and you only get into consciousness stuff that you attend to, it gets into short-term memory, and if lucky, it gets into long-term memory. And then you can retrieve it from there. So you get involved in a circular process, and the before and after becomes a matter of definition. But whatever reaches consciousness, we would say, has been prepared by neuronal processes that are not consciously accessible until there's a result that is sufficiently consistent to be attended to, and then you get it into consciousness.
I think one other issue that is relevant to this general area is the boundary between what is conscious and what is unconscious. And there may be certain classes of phenomena. So, for example, the ability to be aware of the processes which generate a grammatical sentence, for example. So I think most scientists would agree that no matter how much deep introspection you engage in, you really cannot become aware of the mechanisms which produce the grammatical sentence. You can become aware of the sentence, but the details of the computations to produce the grammar is what we may call impenetrable.
Impenetrable.
And to the Datu Tim Dantuma Kandis, Chin Yunguyabati, Lola Shaguyabati, Kazu Shishin Charache, Jebachebine, Easy Tempene, Zan Lu, Yamatu.
So linguists have developed theories for that, but it has not come from their experience.
Yeah.
But the other related point, if I can just make one other brief point, is that one interesting issue for this dialogue is that with certain kinds of mind training, there are domains that have been unconscious for most people, which we may be able to bring to the level of consciousness, which may then confer certain advantages. And that's a hypothesis.
로잔.
Yeah.
미규만 보시부지리아 지간다.
하나만이야지.
그래요. 동문도 주마토에게.
어.
가사 고라는 것도 주마토에게. 야 지금 시베 남샤 가시지. 가시지야. 시베 영화 가시지. 야 로장제.
네.
그러니까 나쇼단 단데 돌렌제 갈든 야 데스 내가 저래 되셔서 용식을 봐서.
I think this is an extremely interesting point, and it is useful to distinguish implicit knowledge from explicit knowledge.
그니 그래.
explicit 랍두가 또 쉐벌라 가사 고라는 것도 줄대베. 아니 시자 다 아니 가사 고라는야 마시 시바 가지질 템벌로 것도 주마토야. 모두 뭐주베. implicit. 여바 가시질이야. Can you give an example?
Yes,
of
I would like to give example.
Yes.
When children learn until the age of 3 or 4, they do not have what we call declarative memory. They learn, but they do not remember the context in which they learned. If you tell them, like the rule system of the language, they will just learn it implicitly and use it, but they don't remember that they have learned it. Or if they are instructed by the mother, don't go here because it's dangerous, because it gives reasons. Child will not go there on the next day. You ask the child, why don't you go there? And the child will give the reasons. And then you ask the child, where do you know this from? And the child will say, well, it's obvious. As if it does not remember where it has learned it. And this is implicit knowledge. You don't know the cause of what you know. And of course, everything that you know from evolution is of this kind. You have not been there. But we have this knowledge. So we apply it.
knowledge level that is bakasa we to beg lord of the kane chungwa chung gyme de 그렇지 temba me 그렇지
So I think we need a clarification. So actually some forms of implicit knowledge are also obscure
to consciousness.
And some forms of implicit knowledge are not obscure, because you just gave an example of implicit knowledge that is not obscure. Because the child knows the reasons, just doesn't know the origin of the reason.
Right.
So the implicit
Some kinds of, there's a Tibetan term, mundugurwa and mundumungurwa. So some kinds of implicit knowledge are, we don't know them, we can use the knowledge, but we don't know it. And some kinds of knowledge, we know it, but we don't know where it came from. Both of these are implicit.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. There's a whole hierarchy. And the problem is that this part of this implicit knowledge, when you don't know where it comes from, becomes convictions. And you are not able to relativate them. You don't discuss about it. You don't discuss about the fact that it is an object, although it is a definition that results from evolutionary knowledge about what an object is. You use knowledge in order to identify it, but you are not aware of it. And if somebody tells you this is not an object, you would just not discuss. And I think part of the cultural mishaps that occur, because people cannot understand each other, is because their cognition has been early primed in this implicit way, and they see the same thing, but it feels different, and it looks different to them, but you have no way to explain to the other that there is this difference, because you can't put it into any relation. And we have this problem, I think, in the moment, in a very, very acid way.
Evan has a comment.
I would just like to make a very quick remark that it is important to keep clear the distinction between a process that is conscious and our conscious knowledge of that process. So our conscious knowledge of that process is a matter of introspection. But a conscious process does not have to be one that is necessarily introspectable. So a bat navigating its environment through sonar may have phenomenal awareness of its environment in the form of the sonar system, but has no capacity for introspection. A very, very young infant may have a whole range of phenomenal aware conscious processes or states, but with no introspective ability. So introspection is a kind of higher order consciousness, but is not consciousness as such.
Yeah.
Quran ngondu kyurde yordes da nyong ngu jege yorde ine ngedi tungudu samsam jege lo nibet kandara rig sorti kebe kyaba yamares shishin da budi yong marbas tena shi pugu chunjuniya ko yungun gyudu jegere de ngedi tungudu sam ngedi tungudu samsam dege ha jige rimba nibe ke shishin da budi le tungmaro denza nganzu dan de conscious dan unconscious de deshe jabe kalya tiglia matuba chede 개침버리셔서 강사들 강사 고라라야 먼저 들어봐다 문주고 시바 강사들 깨버님이 깨받치고 얻어서
뭐지 저거 가면 뭐 봐. 나 다른 타임이 돼. 온부 시바도 똑바 뒤여 쳐야지. 한테 타냐 해물 보다.
네.
또 뭔구지 벤데게 안 되지 송년지 통돼야지. 온부시에 가는데 그래 거거든.
네.
답변한다. 가시도 원하시는 남은 আস을잖아요. 그럼 가시도 원하시는 남의 루체에 있는 이루 떡에 나도 좀 신기야. 가시도 원하시는 남한테 와.
네. Holiness was saying that although we may, have this discussion later on, but what seems to be crucial from the Buddhist point of view, listening to your presentation, is the need to make a distinction, categorical distinction between what is perceptual and sensory experiences on the one hand, and what are thought processes that are, mediated by concepts on the other. And and sometimes, even from the Buddhist point of view, you can have a form of illusion which is actually an illusion, but you can't help but see it. And of course, in the Buddhist context, this is used with respect to the theory of emptiness, where although by using the Madhyamaka reasoning, we know that the object in front of us has no independent intrinsic reality. So although we know, as a result of the Madhyamaka analysis, we may know what is being perceived as intrinsically real, an independent object out there is a distortion, but we can't help but see the object in this manner. And the mind-only school has a similar kind of suggestion where they reject the notion of external reality independent of the observer. So at the same time, they would agree that we continue to see the object as being out there, outside, independent of our perception.
So the talk about the one sheet, the the primitive choice to did one wish of the you don't wish to
So to relate this distinction that was made in Buddhist epistemology to the beautiful picture that you presented,
I think not only Buddhist, but I think according to ancient Indian thought.
So this distinction between the sensory versus the thoughts or conceptual thoughts, the more primitive levels of cognitive processes that are going on, from this epistemological point of view, would be understood more at the level of the sensory experiences.
Right.
Whereas the complexity that we see in the human brain, where there's a lot more processing and interpretation going on, perhaps may be related more to the level of thought, because humans tend to have much richer and complex forms of thought compared to the other animals.
Well, 이는 남중간조 안다 이루 똑발레 대야지 망체 공연 왕식이 그게 메시지 키운데 그 디가는 양도 스타로 망체.
So most of the
the
so most of the thought processes that we experience as human beings
in
on the ordinary level, they all follow after some form of sensory modalities.
But I think you can see this very nicely in the graph. For phenomenal awareness, just for primary sensory experience, this circuit is enough. Here.
Like to hear a tone and make a response to a tone.
And because rats have this phenomenal awareness for sure. But in order to have no input and reason and do what you do in meditation, for example, and you see this very nicely, neurons that are sitting here in these higher areas, they only talk to neurons sitting in other higher areas. It's a closed system, and you can disconnect it completely from the periphery, and it will still work.
So can they be connected to the periphery as well?
You can have a stimulus that is, in other words, the higher cortex can operate in isolation from the periphery, but it can also relate to the periphery.
Yes, of course, but you can decide, depending on your attentional mechanisms, whether you take into consideration what comes in here. You can also ignore it completely and still go on and process stored information, deliberate and run through these circles. The higher the system becomes, the more autonomous it becomes relative to the periphery.
Although one interesting issue, and I don't know what you think of this, Wolf, is that some emotional areas of the brain, like the amygdala, have connections all the way down to the primary sensory cortices. And so the emotional areas seem to be very much connected to the sensory systems.
Well, they get different information. He talks about structures that make you afraid or startled. There is some direct path from the sensory organ to the structure. If you see a spider, you want to be very quickly. But the same structures are also used to make you bad feelings after you have an incoherent thought. So you also have input to these structures from these very high areas. And so self-generated concepts, if there's a conflict, also activate these structures, which then make you feel uneasy. So there are different ways to these structures, but they're always the same, value-assigning systems.
Tenzin ngunjuwa. You temper zimbe, tenzin shuk tabu chiyeba kudule, di beji emotion mendo.
Emotion nal tenzin shao ma tenzin kono de emotion ko ai.
So what? So the the emotion, 상월로 원자도 제대로서 수도와 원부시도 제대로서. This is emotion today. So there will be 차단소 today. 공연 왕시 때는 용되기도 와. 但이루 거라는 때는 그러나 말즈는 나지 숙식을 때 인도잖아요. 그 왕서 좋아합니다.
말단 이게 알아오래. quand 왕서는 대화 요레스트 고체도니네 미고 마대버 제제.
공간도 공시셔.
그런 왕서 쓰고 말해. 이게 단디 명확하게 amygdala. Because you were talking about amygdala. So that's the basis of
one of them.
One of several structures that are important for emotion.
그래서 emotion 기계에 그돌이야 되게 간다. 뒤집어 셔버라고 저. 그것도 저도 삼을.
나래 대송수.
셔서 와 자자가 앞에는 나오냐면 난진 문주 숙심을 기계에 그돌이야. emotion 만들어서. 이 왕서는 저 아이에서.
So you mentioned
남바랑 계셨다.
I mean, of course, this is something internal to the Buddhist kind of debate, but you mentioned the fact that the emotion centers, particularly the amygdala, is directly connected with this very primary phenomenal awareness mechanism. What about
emotions?
In the case of Buddhism, a strong sense of grasping itself. So from the Buddhist point of view, it's an afflicted state of mind. So would you say that would be also directly connected to the sensory?
I think that's the emotion. From the Buddhist viewpoint, from Madhyamika viewpoint, that's the emotion.
Yes.
The fundamental emotion.
Yes, yes. And
so that,
but that object is not any of the external objects like forms, sounds, and so on. It's just one's own self. So probably they're not. It's not related directly to the sensory experiences.
I don't know.
But I think His Holiness is raising a very interesting point, and I think that to the extent that one component of when a Western psychologist uses the term self, one component that is often referred to are memories related to oneself. This sense of grasping may distort, if you will, or modulate the memories related to the self. And so there may be, and the brain is wired to allow that to happen. It's also the case that even simple reward, which may produce grasping, will affect how the brain processes visual information from at the very earliest stages of the visual cortex. So that there are many different stages at which grasping or other afflictive processes can affect the information processing in the brain.
No.
Following on Richie's comment, I believe there's some work in neuroscience that suggests a distinction between liking, appreciating the pleasurable qualities of something, and wanting. And that seems very relevant to this important distinction in Buddhism about the sort of destructive effect of grasping emotion. Unfortunately, I do not know much more than that, than just that these two kinds of positive valence exist and are implemented in different parts of the brain. But maybe Richie could fill in what I can't remember.
Well, very briefly, there is this distinction between liking and wanting. And this has been studied in the context of addiction initially, to distinguish between an individual's response to an addictive substance. And one of the outcomes of that research is that what addiction does is it actually strengthens the wanting but decreases the liking.
No. 그래서 간다 직다 되버냐냐 맞다 그 되병 뭐 중은 뒤걸냐 이침베기 대화 저봐 대화기야다 아니 대화기야니 뭐디 곧 대생카가 이버지다 에딕션 중백하려야 제버체는 뒤걸야 에딕션 치삼 죽지 뭐 뒤걸야 들이야 에딕션 또 간다 지 장한다 탐하다 들이야 에딕션이 봐 디 치삼 죽지 뭐 디저기 대 유를 세버데 죽지 뭐 죽지 죽체로 집어 가시질이야 야디 세버 계세 유디 냠수 용은 되고 텔레템베 대화기에 저봐 디 총총총총 그러지.
And there are also different chemicals in the brain which are more related to one versus another.
Den draske je nemen missie benanda die milum success shadow die chiji be sumare. 나와디 밀름 나와디 chiji sumare. 타고 이지지 더 유인세로. 자자가 밀름 냠수녀 네걸이야 다 그게 chiji be 숙지 샤르체 디 이루티기 다 쉐디 거거든.
나래.
자 디니걸이야 원부자 주는 저 지가 아이메.
Yes. So this is, you know,
이 권해 주의 따라봐. 주시부수 시작와.
this may not be directly related to what we're discussing here, but in the Buddhist text, there is a discussion of the status of the dream objects, the objects in a dream, and they're referred to as and they're understood to be subtle kind of forms, and they're referred to as the mental object forms. And so the suggestion here is that in the dream state, so and there are different types of mental object forms, but this is one of them. And the suggestion here is that in the dream state, the experience of awareness or conscious experience is only at this mental level, not the sensory level. But when you experience the dream, you can experience also the image of the colors as well. So, and the object exists. So, since it is a kind of a form, and it's not an object of the sensory perceptions, therefore it is referred to as the mental object forms. So, when when someone has that kind of experience in that dream state, would you say that the sensory apparatus at the kind of primitive phenomenal awareness level, are they still active or no?
Yeah, this is an extremely important point you make here. And there are data on it. And the data are taken from, not from dreaming people, because it's difficult to know when they dream, but from...
Can't you...
Rapid eye
RAM?
But the correlation is not so good.
I see.
But you can do it. You can do it with patients who have hallucinations.
His Holiness was saying that the scientific explanations that he has heard earlier is now being repudiated by the later presenters.
Skeptical. Okay.
Yeah, you're right. But something that is related is the hallucination of patients with schizophrenia. When they see or hear.
His Holiness is discussing with the monks here because he was wondering whether the status of the object in the dream are, whether or not we can actually say it's the same as the object of the hallucination experiences.
Difficult question.
Because in the experience of the hallucinating person, the sensory modalities are very active.
Yes, and you see in the brain scan that during hallucination you have activity in the higher brain regions, which also happens when we just imagine something. If we imagine something visual or auditory, the same higher centers become active as if you would really see it.
The point is, when you're sleeping, the senses are not active. That's right. There's some doubt about whether it's the same as hallucination.
But even in hallucinations, the senses are not active. The patients are in the dark in the scanner, and they hear a voice, and there's nothing. And in this case, you see an additional activation. When you just imagine language, and you do it yourself and you know it's your own imagination. You activate your speech centers, all of them. In addition, you activate centers up here that you need in order...
Sonia was wondering whether it's hallucination based on something that you see and you misconstrue like a mirage. So I was mentioning that it's purely internal.
Purely internal.
Instead of schizophrenia, it doesn't have to be a misinterpretation of an outer object.
There's nothing outside. Yes. It's all generated inside, and it is perceived as if it came from outside. And the reason is that in schizophrenia, unlike when we just imagine something, they do not activate only the higher brain centers which you activate when you imagine speech, but activity spreads all the way down to the primary sensory regions, so that the pattern which these brains generate internally is indistinguishable from a pattern that would occur if there was a speaker outside. And this is probably the reason why these people cannot distinguish between self-generated and coming from outside. Mechanism is not quite known. And this brings us to another very, very important question. How does the brain know when it is right? And how does it know when it is wrong? And how can it distinguish activity? Remember, it's only neurons making complex spatiotemporal patterns of activity all the time, self-active. And there must be an instance in the brain, and this gets us to the next point of the self, that is able to distinguish activity, which is just computations, no result yet, and the result, and then it can even know internally, self-referentially, whether this result is valid, or probably valid, or maybe wrong. And so this self-referentiality is a big mystery because we don't know how it's done.
was saying that
간다 참여 롯디 뭐 규리심에 내가 대가랑이야 디참이 미셔야 됩니다.是吧? 但예수 양고 당시에 전화했던 시에니 야는 신신전야 저 간지 늦게 도하는 전에 인터 참이 미셔야 마도 시험도. 롱것이 직시고도.
So from the Buddhist epistemological perspective, this issue of how does the cognitive processes, I mean from Buddhist language, know it's right and it's wrong, and that question may be easier on the sensory level because there's a kind of a reference to the object, but it becomes more complex at the level of the mental processes. And here in the epistemological text, there is already a recognition that, for example, when you are mentally perceiving something which is actually a valid form of knowledge, in the state itself, when you're actually having the knowledge, there is nothing that would allow you to verify that this is a true instance of knowledge. That kind of verification can only come as a result of a subsequent evaluation, either by reference to an earlier experience or a memory or some other avenue.
I think we need to take a tea break, so we will take a 15-minute break and we'll come back to the self.
Okay.
two key problems that relate to challenges that you raised in your book, Your Holiness. One has to do with the issue of the self and whether there is a self and its location, and the other concerned with relations between mind and brain. So, Wolf, please.
Wasn't Anton asking a question that would be optimistic?
I want to add a very optimistic touch. We have learned from Professor Singer, that was a side remark, but that is very important, that the brain is the only organ or system which we developed, which became more complex, but at the same time did not become more specialized. Okay? Now this statement, to me, opens up the possibility that actually our cognitive abilities are not limited. And the reason why I say that is, from computer science, we know the notion of what is called a universal computer. This was invented by someone called Alan Turing. A universal computer is a computer which is able to solve any mathematical problem. And such a universal computer works with very limited resources. It doesn't have to be very complex. Now, I can see a reason that evolution developed the brain such that it is a universal computer in a sense, that it can solve, in principle, any problem. The only limit now being the size of the memory and the time it would take to solve a problem. But now something comes in which is very human. We are the only species which are able to expand the size of the memory which we have. We can use books, we can use computers for memory and so on. And we are also the only species which can expand the time it takes. We can expand the time it takes even beyond our own lifetime. This is the invention of culture. Future generations can continue working on problems on which we work and maybe find a solution. So this is just an optimistic point I would like to add.
Just to add one caveat maybe, which is the universal computer that Turing spoke about can pose any problem that is well defined within the framework of mathematics. But we seem to be very often thinking about sort of ill-defined things, which may not be so. Who knows, maybe.
Let's wait for the next generation to solve it.
Mathematics.
We are optimists. I would like to...
I think everybody optimistic. Therefore, we come here. If there's no basis of optimism, there's no reason to come here.
It's a self-selected group.
Yes, so true.
So, Matthew?
Yes, just about the limitations. We were talking also with Anton at the break. We may conceive a limitation in terms of the number of information a single person in a single lifetime could gather. But when it comes to developing human qualities, who can say there's a limitation to compassion, to altruism, to inner peace? I mean, how will you define that kind of limitation? Because this is not something that is basically quantitative. It's a matter of depth, of the purity and the intensity of the experience, but perhaps not purely, it's a qualia in a way. And so that's very also optimistic in terms of becoming a better human being, that you don't see why there should be a limitation to developing pure compassion or awareness and something like that.
Yeah. The ten temperate 해서 다 ten temperate 좀 못으나 왜 가고 그래. 참 니주서 때 탐절로 세전으로 뮤직 세전으로. 다 ten temperate 줘야 돼. 영서 샤래.
On this question of the limitless potential for the development of the qualities such as compassion, even from the Buddhist point of view, he is saying that there is an issue here, because one of the supposition is to understand that the basis upon which these qualities...
I think for Buddhists, I think not much problem. But Buddhist idea come to in common level, very difficult.
Yeah. Because one of the key premises is that the basis upon which these qualities arise is
the good quality of mind.
Mind, yeah.
Mental level. That's the
basis.
The whole sort of idea. Because of the subtle mind, no beginning, no end. Always there. So continuation there. So therefore, one lifetime, some experience, and subtle way imprint on that subtle mind. So the next life, some proper environment come. Then these
seeds,
these seeds or imprints in the mind then easily develop. So that's why you see, we believe that among the same student or even same parent, some in certain field very quickly learn, some less. Of course, one part is from the particle. Of course, have some explanation. But then also the previous sort of
imprints. So in the case of children from the same parents, we see these differences.
So
Okay.
Could you tell us why?
There's a kind of a debate going on. Saying that
Buddhist viewpoint is so Buddhism idea
because we're bringing an idea of a limitless potential for the development of qualities such as compassion, which is a Buddhist idea, into this level of this common discourse. And then to convey that.
Another word, my usual say secular ethics
context.
In that field, is it those because of the Buddhist special sort of reason or views, is it cannot bring.
But in your book, Your Holiness, to quote, you say, while there are limitations on the nature of physical action or athletic skill, there are essentially no limits on mental development.
No limits.
Page 147.
So of course that's from the Buddhist point of view.
The secular ethic
so if it is so if the presentation is from the Buddhist perspective, then it is appropriate. But if happen to be in a secular ethics context, then that would be a slip of tongue.
Well, at some point, I think it would be wonderful for Your Holiness to amplify on this point, because this is a critical issue for Western scientists. Rarely do we encounter a domain in which it can be said that there are essentially no limits on development. And I think that this is something where we would very much like to hear from you, to explain to us more about what you mean by this.
First of all, we have the big challenge of how to prove the reality of consciousness that is independent of, that is not reducible to brain.
I think answer only come, some of us, if you spend at least a few months, just to try to, because of that, actual experience the luminosity survey.
The luminous nature of mind, yeah.
All thought stop. All sort of sensorial sort of level
Activities.
stop. The thought process also stop. Then stay there. A few occasions I try. So, of course, not sufficient time. Then you get, at the beginning, you get some kind of feeling of just nothing.
Kind of absence.
Then remain longer period. Then gradually just feeling, experience.
It's a kind of just an experience. Yeah.
So then, through one's own experience, then we can say, oh, there is mental, some kind of that.
There is a phenomenon. There is a primary phenomenon.
But then we have a very interesting problem. Anton just said the limitlessness of our capacities comes because we can rely on the next generation to build on us and take the knowledge we have acquired, because we can pass on this knowledge acquired at lifetime as far as it explicit knowledge that is available to third-person perspective. But the knowledge you talk about is only accessible from the first-person perspective. And is it possible to transmit a qualia across a generation? Or does not every generation have to start from scratch? And now I understand why you need incarnation, because otherwise it would not work.
Oh, that's a rebirth, yes.
Yeah, that's
rebirth. So that's a complicated issue.
Yeah, but it's a critical one.
Yes, all right.
So the limitlessness of mental development may depend upon rebirth, but that's not to say that our assumptions about the limits of mental development within science might not be readily challenged by Buddhism. There could be still quite a lot of development even in a single lifetime, as Matthew was referring to. There still may be a tremendous potential for development, even if it's not limitless, still a tremendous potential.
Yes, through training of mind.
And
we can, you see, improve, right?
Well, maybe science can help to have crash courses. Yeah, there may be other methods that are faster.
It's possible.
And one of the main drama of our modern world and existence is we vastly underestimate the power of transformation of mind. We are ready to do so much for develop our health. We know we do jogging on this bicycle that goes nowhere, and we do all kinds of things to learn and everything, but we are so almost powerless to know how we could use that potential of human transformation. And that's maybe the best contribution that we could do.
I think up to now, I think majority of the people, I think, never pay attention about our inner value. That's the problem. So always, you see, seeking answer from externally.
Outside.
Outside.
There's so much in there. Much more of the brain is occupied with its own management than is actually dealing with the outer environment. So we don't need the environment for a long time.
Yes?
Should we go to the self?
Yes.
Let's go to the self.
Let's go to the self. And I think this is an interesting point, because here Western science comes to a conclusion that is much closer to what Buddhist philosophy intuitively developed than what Western belief systems have developed. And it's very strange that we made this mistake in the West, and then with science we disprove ourselves and get much closer to what you have always been saying. So, of course, neurobiologists are convinced that all mental functions, so also the self, the mind, are based on neuronal processes. So this has an important implication. These mental phenomena cannot precede the neuronal phenomena, but they must follow them.
Then the mental processes that get in Lazaki Gualia temperature. And then the kitty Lazy Guagi Jebumato, the Murna Chua, Shatu Maris.
So this raises a problem with the causation of behavior by mental phenomena. We think that everything is prepared by neuronal interactions, and that part of this becomes conscious, much does not become conscious, and that when it enters consciousness, it's always after it had already been prepared in the neuronal process.
어떻게 공간다. 릭직 컨셔스고 릭직 인 컨셔스 도움을 가서 봤다.
남식이
말보다 늘 가서 보자. 건드릴 수 그래.
So you spoke about some processes becoming conscious and some not becoming conscious. So we seem to be using the word consciousness in a different sense.
So exact meaning.
So what's the exact meaning?
I would say that conscious contents.
나도 consciously 해야 말다. Yes.
If something is in consciousness, you can talk about it, you know about it, you can put it into declarative memory, and you can recall it in a context-dependent way. And it can also, contents in consciousness give you the argument. You can say, I did this because, and so forth. While if it's not in the consciousness, if you're not consciously aware of the whatever made you do this, you cannot talk about it. You can say, I did it, but I don't know why. So this would be the operational definition. Now,
det är nog inte mycket så ena det. Det är det det stället och Tommy Shibada. Dogje. 다른 상해제야 그지로다. 거기 상해제야 말이지. 그 팀 그러다. 단 두시스로네요. 어머셔를 중얼해. 저 상황도 중얼해. 두시. 아.
원시기인데 그 원시기 봐. 가장 그런 게 싱그럽다 간다.
이 나는 망해가 매이나?
나는 망해면 이네 마도. 네. 원시 참기인데 그 원시기 봐. 가장 그런 게. 리코로.
네.
저는 바로 통고도나.
아, 너 건설도 시합이 있는다.
그래.
미가 너 원골 때문에 미기 시합 장장이 레서도 만드는 친가이나.
레스.
완전 나와르디 원비 시합스는 그런 미기 시합스라이나. 미기 원골 때인데 그렇지.
그래.
그 유지기 아주 다게 제대로 말해. 그래. 다 안들디 전입의 시합이나 인심이 레서도 된 시합마도 미국 뭐 장장 그때 남 규경 소리마도
되는 왕부도 미공부 야샤고 그러 레벨 야샤고 그래.
그래.
지금도 왕된 공부도 없지. 왕부 치료던. So sorry, this is partly an attempt to understand how we can juxtapose the word conscious, becoming conscious and not conscious to the person within the context of Buddhist language of epistemology. And there is a term called ngundu kyurpa, which means something that is manifest to the person. So for example, like when the discussion centered on when someone is having a visual experience, is the person necessarily aware of having that experience? So if the person is aware of that, having that experience, you would say that is conscious. But would you also say there are sensory experiences which the person is not aware of?
Yes, certainly. I will give you an example, if time allows, where you can show that brains can process stimuli, understand them, react appropriately, and the person as a whole not being aware of having perceived something consciously.
Visual stimulus.
A visual stimulus in this case, but it would work for all modalities. And then you can show that the electrical activity of the brain differs in the two cases. Maybe I cut the story short. If you just have a stimulus, you process it, you recognize it, you respond properly, but you are not aware that you have seen it, because the instruction to the subject is respond in any case, either this or that, forced choice. And even if you think you have not seen anything, guess. And you find that the guessing is nearly 100% right. So you know it has been seen, processed, and the response is appropriate. But the subject would say, no, I just guessed, I haven't seen anything. And the other cases where they actually see it, put it in short-term memory, and can talk about it. And the performance is about the same in the two cases. But you can then show that the pattern of electrical activity in the two cases is very different. Oh. The stimulus that is just processed and produces a response generates local activity, which is an oscillatory pattern. But there's very little. There's very little communication or coordination of activity across wider brain areas. And the stimulus that gets consciously perceived produces about 200 milliseconds after it is presented a brief state during which many of these areas, many of these areas widely distributed across this mantle here of this cortical sheet, for a brief period of time, not very long, 100 milliseconds or 200 milliseconds, they very precisely synchronize their activity. They all go together for a brief moment of time. And that's the only difference. It's an increased amount of coherence, which is reflected in a high degree of synchrony over many, many different areas for a sufficiently long period of time. And if this happens, the brain as a whole says, I have perceived consciously. And then there are a number of secondary processes. Once this has happened, it's like lighting a fire, getting over a threshold. Once this has happened, then process starts which puts the information in short-term memory, keeps it there, then you have access to the language areas, and you can see all these secondary processes happening. But the main difference seems to be that the activity produced by the stimulus is, in the one case, just producing local responses that go through the system until it gets out in the motor system. And in the other case, it ignites a holistic pattern of activity that is very coherent. And this makes the difference between conscious and subconscious processing. That's all we know so far. Not much.
And they really are Lebanon, Namjuti, Chawadi, make a local level. Once a Chikumachuba, Tambu, Tarang, and they shall Madame.
You need none of my government. Touch it again.
You should also relate it
Forced
to the
choice,
Lama stuff. This is the most.
Right? The Yuna. The
yeah. Maybe before you ask the question,
in a young chick damgu yore, intermediate dangu yore, cause experiment chico jagova. Inga Utsuk Yagores, Logurva, Matuna Yang, Utsuk Yagores, Utsuk Yan, Pecha Katampa, Dagran race,
Tonjo to Tangors.
Ton 19 race. Inga Kane love to Gumendonga, Ton songs love to Gumare. She's a Nalamanga Rang Marava. She's a leopard like a jaggy or any ton songs love to Gumendu, in a intermediate danguina. Then also can the danda, Gachikatampa, Pechi Gachikatampa, Dagran, correct.
Retaganda, second, Togan, let's do Pechi Ilogan, no. The Gombatonata, the Gombo and some to call that
Now, what is so interesting in this context is that the results of Richard Davidson on meditating Buddhist monk, they find when they get in deep state of meditation, pattern that looks very similar to the pattern that you have when you consciously experience. They also see increased synchronization of these high-frequency oscillations. And so it looks as if when you meditate, you bring contents which are somewhere in the brain, because there is no outer stimulation, at the level of consciousness, using the same mechanism that in perception you use in order to make something conscious, to coordinate the activity in widespread areas of the brain. And probably it's different areas than in conscious perception. I don't know what you activate, what you couldn't tell us probably. But from outside it looks similar. That's all one can say.
One of the differences in case of trying to rest in the pure awareness or whatever, is that there's no specific content.
Yeah.
It's the most refined aspect of awareness in a way. So it's the pure aspect of consciousness you are talking about, but without precisely the content. You are not aware of a dog having come in the room, but it's the pure awareness process in a way, which is quite
So maybe you
interesting.
just can focus this activity on these higher areas.
Zimba 말해 비치지, 그렇죠? Zimba 말해 비치는 거라도 시바 소마 마시고 그래가 해리 돼야 돼.
되게 그런 쉐바 냥냥.
네. 세리 잡.
Evan, did you have?
Yes, I would just like to introduce, philosophers always like to introduce distinctions, but I'm going to introduce another one because it seems very close to what you were talking about when you talked about sensory awareness or sensory content and then something being manifest to the person. So in Western philosophy and in cognitive science, we often distinguish between what is called phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness. And the idea here...
No, what do you mean by access?
I'm going to explain. I'll give an example. The idea here would be, suppose you have a rapid emotional experience. It happens very fast, and there's a feeling that has a certain kind of tone of fear or pain or avoidance or withdrawal, and it has a felt character, but it happens very quickly. That's an example of phenomenal consciousness. But access consciousness would refer to your ability to conceptualize what's happened to you, to use it in subsequent reasoning, to have it play a role in memory, to guide or control your behavior. And the point here is that not all of the contents of phenomenal consciousness are necessarily available to access consciousness. And that would seem close to the distinction between a kind of sensory quality and manifest to the person.
Yeah, the self. Sorry. There is a striking discrepancy between the intuition that we have on our brains, at least between the Western intuition on how the brain works and how science thinks the brain works. And this is, the Western intuition is this, and this is a drawing by Descartes, that because we experience consciousness as a unitary phenomenon, we experience ourself as something that is unity. We think that when we observe, there is a point in the brain where all the information must come together because we experience the world as closed and coherent. That there is a center somewhere in the brain where everything comes together, is interpreted, where decisions are reached, plans are made, and where the self sits and says, me. And this is a very Western idea. And it has transpired Western philosophy since the antique times. It has always been like that. And Descartes even tried to find this place. And he had his assistants, philosophers, cut brains of cows to look for a structure which exists only once. And since the brain is symmetrical bilaterally, there are only two structures which occur only once. And this is the epiphysis. It's in the middle. And there's another one, the hypophysis. And now Descartes said this is it.
The dark net.
Now, he was wrong.
French philosopher, Descartes. French.
So what we see today is, and I apologize for the German writing here, I got it wrong, is that there are these many, many different areas in the cerebral cortex. And they all do different things. And they are specialized for certain subfunctions, and they all do the same computation, but they get different information. Now, we also know how they are connected. And this is what you see here. Apologies for the projector. Not it's much nicer what His Holiness sees here. But each of the black points that you see in this graph, they represent a cortical area with millions and millions of neurons. And each of these colorful connections, which you don't see well, they stand for massive projections between those areas. So each of these black points is a cortical area, the ones you have seen before, those colorful things. And what the point of this diagram is taken from a cat brain, but if you did it from a monkey or a human brain, it would look the same, would just be even more complex, is that there is no point of convergence in such brains. There's a hint of a hierarchy, but there is no president, there is no director, no conductor, but it is a highly distributed system where everybody talks to everybody, more or less. And in this system, extremely complex spatio-temporal patterns of activity emerge, which is always active. And you must imagine that if a percept is generated there, like a dog that is barking and you touch the fur, then you have activity in the visual areas, in all of them. Some are interested in motion, others in color, yet others in shape. You have the auditory areas active because they process the barking, the sound, and you have the somatosensory areas active because you touch the fur. But there's no place in this brain where the whole dog would be represented in a point. You have a spatio-temporally distributed pattern of activity that is extremely complex, and this is the simplest, not further reducible description of the representation of a barking dog with a particular fur. That's it. And if you want to go from there to the motor to the output, there's a parallel stream of activity to the motor centers, which are again many. And it produces a complex pattern there, which eventually makes you either run away from the dog because you are afraid, or... So there's no point of convergence. Nothing ever comes together. It stays distributed. It just talks to each other. So you have these widely encompassing spatio-temporal activity patterns and nothing more. And that raises the question, how does it work? Why can this system think about itself, that it has a self that is a point somewhere? How do you get the unity of perception? And these are the big questions in neuroscience that are unresolved. Because also here is the problem of how a material process does the phase transition into something that we experience as mental, as non-material. It's probably information. It's probably something that emerges only when we talk to each other and mirror each other in these systems, that these concepts can come into the world, but they are here now. Now we have the problem. The question is, how are these many distributed processes bound together? How can such a system take the initiative, decide on something, and then, as we already said, how does it know that something that has emerged in there is correct? There must be certain patterns which are better than others, but we don't know what the signature is for goodness. And so I will jump over many steps. There would be the possibility in classical thinking that if you have many different parts that you want to bind together, you produce a hierarchy, connections up to the Dalai Lama or to president or whatever. This is not... One could do this with anatomical connections. But this is not how it is done. because it cannot be done that way, because you would need too many of these pyramids. For all objects of the world, for all possible contents, you can't have isolated pyramids. So it's done in this distributed way. And the question is, how does this system organize itself? Because in such a distributed system, you have an individual neuron must say two things at the same time. It must speak two languages at the same time. All it can do is discharge electrical pulses. It has nothing more. It must tell...
그래서 discharge 그렇지 거.
So it must tell the rest of the brain the feature for which I'm responsible, because some neurons like red color, green color, black, and so on, is present. And it does this by increasing the activity it produces. So the others know black is there. But at the same time, the neuron must tell the others, I am part of a large family of neurons, which in this very moment represents this mouse. So it must at the same time have another code in which it says, we are related. And
민요마를 차이는잖아요. 스무 사람은 맨을 세는 해지신 이거로. 디 슈긴 같은 경우는 인시나 등지심도 샤마르.
간에서.
맞다. 가서다. 직선 미디어 차대서 그러다. 선 미디어 차대서 디 차상관은 누구도 내지는 정도.
So imagine, for example, there is someone who has a mental problem, say like a schizophrenia, and has this hallucination. At the brain level, is the expression localized or is it all distributed?
Some particular location?
His Holiness, you should become a scientist. You are a scientist. Because you just discovered something. It is so that this code that is used as a code of relations is the synchrony in time. If things happen together, everybody knows this is related. If they happen out of phase, it's not related. Now, in normal perception, and in conscious perception in particular, these large families of neurons, they synchronize their activity with high precision over large areas. We talked about this already. Now, in schizophrenic patients, this is disturbed. They cannot produce these precise temporal relations. They can oscillate in high frequencies, but they cannot properly synchronize. And this is probably the reason why they have this...
So, so could you say, for example, in terms of now, in terms of kind of temporal, if we were to look at this problem from a temporal perspective, can you say that this
it's a
loss of
short period?
Yes.
From where it starts?
So this loss of synchrony, can we say it begins from this particular point, or
simultaneous?
Or is it simultaneous?
It's a very quickly spreading. You have many oscillators. If you think about many oscillators which are coupled, and they do this.
But start.
And then there is a very quick phase transition, self-organizing phase transition, in which they get organized.
So is it this loss of synchrony is simultaneously distributed?
Yeah.
Or does it start from somewhere?
Well, you
Is it propagated from one point?
Good question.
So that is the seed of self.
Because it's always the same. If it starts from one localized area, that could be the seed of self.
Yeah. Good point. I don't know. My guess would be no, because it emerges from the synchrony emerges from reciprocal interactions among many partners, and in such a case you can't really say who is starting. It is an emerging state.
Yes, it's from all parts.
Yeah. They pull each other in phase, and you don't know exactly. There is no master puller. It's a self-organizing process. But you can see it nicely in brain scan, in electrical images. So if, for example, you look at such a picture, you may see a face. Down here you don't see a face. And then if you look at the brain activity, and here's the frequency of this oscillatory activity, and here's time, here's the face is shown, and around this time it is recognized. And if you recognize a face, then you have this, in the particular frequency range, which is what is here, 25 hertz, you have this strong synchronization of activity if there is a face, which you don't have if there's no face. And schizophrenic patients have a problem with this.
So
could you go back to the other side?
But maybe this is
so can we go back to the
that one? Yeah.
So in both instances, for example, in the first case of first image, so you're looking at the same image. There's a temporal phase.
Both case appearance.
So there is the appearance of those visual stimuli in both instances. Now, in the first instance, at a certain point, you recognize the face, and then there is this neural expression of synchrony. Yeah. But in the second case, because there is no recognition of the face, so there is no synchrony.
Why that?
Why is there no red in the lower image?
Because the brain cannot make out a coherent representation. Yeah. It doesn't know what it is.
No, even at the first impulse. The idea here is that the first yellow is a sense impression before it's been interpreted.
Well, that may be a piece of search activity that is frustrated and then collapses. But this one is perhaps a little bit easier to understand. This is a top-down view on the skull, and every point here is an electrode, so it takes activity from a particular part of the cortex. And all the black lines, they connect sites which during this phase go into this high synchrony. And you see that it comprises nearly the whole brain. And this is when the stimulus is consciously perceived. This is another experiment where you have conscious and subconscious processing. And this is when it's processed but not conscious. So the difference between conscious and non-conscious is really, one would say, the neuronal correlate of a conscious state is written here, that it is a metastable state, because it's very transient, of a nonlinear dynamical system.
Can you explain?
So, yeah, that's what it is, but it doesn't help us much, because it's a very abstract description. And if we would like to describe in concrete terms the exact neuronal correlate of this conscious state, one would have to demarcate the activity of maybe 1 billion of neurons in a huge matrix of numbers and say this is the correlate of a conscious experience. So it would be an extremely high-dimensional vector. And this is the problem we are going to have, His Holiness. We will be more and more precise, describe in more and more detail the neuronal correlate of a mental phenomenon. And it will be numbers, complex numbers. It will be spatial temporal patterns that are not imaginable because they will be high-dimensional. And then the question comes, why are we doing all this?
High-dimensional.
High-dimensional.
Conscious awareness la diga le sheba ngunju ba ta kansa korang de tong de tong du sam chin ngut ju de ta yelo nyambo yu de ni sheba jo di gi da chinyi ru sha be na non linear la diga le ya la
junje ge ru ma do
kada gyunchi ban ji 태간 도니 많이 봐 진 dynamical system pendulum 망보실 때 되는 얘기 아니 What was this metastable?
Metastable, because it is, this is attractor dynamics, so it is something that is temporarily stable, but then can immediately change, and it will never ever come back to the same place, because this is what makes time perceivable, that the brain never ever comes back to where it was.
유점시다. 되는 거야 그 템포를 붙여. 그냥 가지는
그 잘로씩
말했어. 대든 대지 돈 대시 되고 그래서 이내 단대라고 그래서 그래서 대시 심을 잡을래 하니 그 뉴럴 그 야만 편집 제와다 아니 지 레자 가지지는 자와지그 위험하다 망부지그 돈 응지게 하고 저걸라네 14로 응지 요르차로 감동으로 왔어. 이제 다 teoti잖아 가르치는데 제고 그랬었나서.
Your Holiness, before we break for lunch, I just want to point out that the work that Wolf described was really pioneered by Francisco Varela, who described patterns of synchrony and its relation to conscious experience. And we owe him a great debt of gratitude for pioneering many of the ideas that were featured, and we'll be continuing with some of his insights in neurophenomenology when we return from lunch today. So thank you very much.
Yes.
Your Holiness, thank you and good morning. Today we will turn our attention to matters of the mind and the brain. And before we get started, I just wanted to, for Your Holiness's sake and for those around, to just very, very briefly remind us that the brain is probably the most complex piece of matter in the universe. It has about 100 billion neurons. It has about 1.5 trillion connections among those neurons. Now, interestingly, more than 40% of the human brain is in the frontal lobe. And we'll be hearing more about the frontal lobe as we go through today and tomorrow. During early pregnancy in humans, there are about 250,000 new neurons that are grown every minute, 250,000 per minute during early pregnancy. On the other hand, in adults like us, about 85,000 cortical neurons in the cortex, die every day, about 85,000. So it's a very dynamically changing process, constantly changing. The brain, although it's a relatively small organ, uses 20% of the total body's oxygen supply. So it demands more oxygen than any other organ. And today we're going to begin to address some key challenges that Your Holiness posed regarding the mind and the brain. Is consciousness a primary phenomenon that transcends biology? We will address the issue of downward causation that we...
downward.
Is there a place in the brain where the self might be located? We will also... What is the relation between first and third person accounts of mental and brain activity? And we'll also address the possibility of free will from the perspective of modern neuroscience, which we'll continue to discuss for the next several days. And certainly that has very important ethical implications. This morning, Wolf Singer, who you first met, I think, in Washington at the Washington meeting, is one of the most eminent neuroscientists in the world today. And we are so incredibly fortunate to have Wolf as part of our mind.
How responsible can we be? What is our definition of guilt? How does this relate to punishment? So things become very interesting now. And I think we watch a time...
chebe gengen kolia paniseda dinega dresha kanti tenga nedun dige tsong manga tadup kebaso nya chebe chebe mando chenibu dual langa shan duyo marwas ta tande chalia lekma ribo tone neju sawo mangba ji shinza ani ngem dan tadup ribo chebe chege shinalia cheribo zu de chege kogob yobaji tongdoso. I just wanted to underline the point that you are making, that in the traditionally these areas have been pretty much reserved for the philosophers, but now as a result of new findings, discoveries in brain science, you're able to address some of these.
So what happens here in this very moment, that scientists talk to philosophers, is also starting to happen in the West now. And so we have the same problems everywhere. Before I go explaining some of the data to you, I would like to, I don't have to remind you about this, but I think it's important to make this point at the beginning of a talk on brain, that we can, of course, only imagine, understand, think, reason what the brain allows us to think, because it is the organ that does all this. And we know that the brain is the product of evolution. I think everybody agrees now. And we know the criteria that have been applied or that are applicable to explain evolution. This is, the organism has to survive and to reproduce. And in order to do this, the organism has to get signals from the world that are relevant for survival. Nothing else is important. Not important for the organism to understand the absolute truth. It's important for the organism to recognize a lion and to run away quickly. So the criteria according to which the cognition has been, or the cognitive system has evolved, are not the criteria that one wants to apply in order to generate a cognitive system that is able to understand the last truth. All that was required is a system.
Last truth.
Or the absolute.
The main point is that the evolution of the chungba instance.
You would agree?
I agree.
So this has of course consequences, because our brain and our cognition could only adapt to the world that is the world of us living beings. It's the world of classical physics, it's the world of solid objects, it's the world in the millimeter to meter range, because this is what is important for us. It's not the world of the quanta. It's not the world of the universe. We don't have to know about the universe in order to survive on this planet. And the consequences that our cognition must be limited. It must have boundaries. It's not possible otherwise, because the criteria according to which it developed are very, very selective and constrained. This means, and I think the days we had behind us when we were all puzzled by the quantum physicists who told us things that we cannot imagine, here we really felt how our cognition is limited, that we cannot feel and understand properly that these things happen. Why? Because we have not been built for it. And this may apply also for other questions. And so I think humbleness is something we need to keep in mind when talking about what I'm saying in the future, because it may be only a very limited explanation of something much bigger. So what do neuroscientists believe?
나래. 근데 지단 레벨 쿠란 중단 겐지엔 되가라. 그 버지기 제도 주버 인자스. 그 타르도 네버 상마 또토에 네버 요마스 자스 브레스. 된자지 뭐뱅 하자 마제 내가 좀 그러셨어. 그런 그 쉬에 되지. 직선은 그 초지네. 내가 내주 준주지는 대배 동주 인식을
So we have very strong beliefs. And one is that all the knowledge that the human being can have and all the programs according to which this knowledge is used, the programs that make our reasoning, so the way in which we apply this knowledge, that all this is contained in what we call the functional architecture of the brain. So the way in which neurons are connected to each other. There's nothing else in the brain but neurons and the way in which they are connected. And out of this emerges an extremely complex dynamics, spatio-temporal patterns of activity. And the architecture that makes these activities possible is the storehouse of all our knowledge and of all the programs according to which this knowledge is used. It's very much different from a computer where you have a memory and a processing unit and some periphery. Here is all together in the functional architecture. So this reduces questions like, where does all this knowledge come from? Where does the brain have its knowledge from? Becomes reduced to the question, what are the factors that made this functional architecture? And there is again evolution, then development, because human brain develops until age of 20. So some of the younger monks still have developing brains, which is good. They can learn much. And during this development after birth,
and in life family, and he will begin this morning by introducing some of these key issues in the context of modern neuroscience. So I turn it over to Wolf.
Good morning, His Holiness. I'm very, very honored to sit here and have the privilege to try to explain some of the mechanisms that we think we understand in the brain. And let me start with something that we discussed last night at dinner. After we have heard from the quantum physicists that there is randomness, unreliability, non-causality, it occurred to me as a biologist that all these properties had to be overcome by nature in order to make it possible to develop life on this planet. Because if things were random, unreliable, and non-causal, no life would be possible, because there would be no solid structures, and it would be impossible for life to maintain itself in homeostasis. So maybe it's an enormous progress to have overcome the laws that govern the very small in order to make life possible. While we probably needed all these mechanisms in order to transform energy into structure. But this is just a speculation. Now, so I would like to talk a little bit about the implications that modern brain research has on classical philosophical questions. Because brain research, coming from the bottom, starts to explore more and more phenomena that have been traditionally been dealt with by philosophers, people of humanity sciences. And so neurobiology has something to say on epistemology, how objective our perception is, because we work with the organ that perceives. The mind-body problem, the big question of how mental qualities can arise from interactions among material objects, in our case, neurons. The constitution of the self, Ritchie has already addressed the question. Is there a place in the brain where the self has its home, decides, plans, acts, takes responsibility, or is there no such place? Is the self outside somewhere? Is the self continuing after the neurons are all dead? All these questions are questions that the neuroscientists now discuss. And finally, there is this discussion on free will, which is becoming very important for the moral philosophy of ethics, because if everything that we can do is prepared by these neurons, the functional architecture of the neurons, the way in which they connect, is modified by experience. So the brain adapts itself to reality in which it is born. But much is already inherited from evolution. So we know what our ancestors, the snails and lower animals, have learned about the world. And I will give you an example that the way in which we learn about causality has already been understood by snails and put into molecular machinery that's still working in our brain. So we sit on their shoulders in our understanding of the world. And then there's, of course, learning that you and me still can do to some extent, because the connections between neurons, they remain a little bit flexible, even in the adult, fortunately.
Not very hopeless, right? Total hopeless, remember that.
So it's only saying, so that means we are not totally hopeless case.
Now, this has again important implications, because this knowledge, which is already in the brain, is used in order to reconstruct the image of the world that we have. Because if you think that in the back of your eye, on the retina, all you have is a two-dimensional homogeneous distribution of different brightness values, nothing else. There are no objects or so. You use your knowledge in order to put all this in order and segment this from the background and identify it as an object. And so if we had not had all this a priori knowledge in our brain that we know from evolution and from early development and from learning, we would not be able to perceive anything. We use this knowledge in order to categorize the world, identify objects, make sense out of it. And we do this, obviously, in a very specific way. It could have been done otherwise, but the world is as it is. We evolved in this world, and so we do it that way. But maybe there's another way. We don't know. So, an important point is that evolution is very conservative. Mechanisms that have been developed sometime during early existence of life, like in this funny snail, they are preserved until